All right, welcome back to Theater History. This is part 4, and I think it's our last part. Today we're going to be talking about modern theater, contemporary theater, and Eastern theater, because we've only been talking about Western theater. So we're going to be taking a look at that in today's screencast or today's lecture. All right, so let's get started. When we left off, we were discussing the box set and how the box set made some changes in theater at the time period, and how that kind of changed the way not only theater sets and plays were written and starting to become a little bit more modern, but also we're going to talk today about how changes in theatrical architecture also changed. So here's an example of one of the old neoclassical auditoriums. And these old neoclassical auditoriums and Elizabethan auditoriums, Shakespearean auditoriums, were typically very long, and the distance from the stage was actually pretty far. So if you want to think about like 75 to 100 yards, that you might be sitting at the farthest point from the auditorium, from the stage. So acting during this time period, and I'm talking about neoclassical restoration theater, not modern theater. So the period that came before this was very exaggerated, much like, if you recall, Greek theater with all of their costumes and masks and everything like that, so people could see and hear them better. In the restoration theater, over exaggerated movements and everything like that was very common so that people could see and understand what was going on. What happened is, as playhouses began to change and began to form this more of like a seashell, I guess, shape to the playhouses, it was able to bring the audience, a larger audience, much closer to the stage. So now you're only about 50 yards from auditorium stage if you're at a very big auditorium. And therefore, you can see what's happening and hear what's happening a lot easier. So that allows actors to begin to change the way they speak and change the way they say words, and even change, in some cases, the storylines. So the closer you are to the stage, the easier it is to see and hear, and the wider and the longer the space, the more detailed and larger sets you can have. So this allows the sets to change and to become more realistic, but this also allows the acting to change. Another thing that made some changes during this time period to make it feel more modern were changes in lighting. So in Shakespeare's time, in neoclassical time, they had the theaters open, or in Shakespeare's time, so that there you could still see what the actors were doing, and there were torches and things like that that were lit as well. During the neoclassical time period, they closed things off, but they used candles or limes. Indestructible lime reactions was what started theater lighting. And if you've ever seen theater lighting in the 1800s, you'll notice that there were things like footlights right at the front of the actors. And then there were things above the actors, lights that were actually shining down and focused in on them. But they were used through this chemical reaction that you would use by pumping gas into like different types of chemical reactions, lime being one of them. So if you've ever heard the phrase "in the limelight," that is a reference to this early kind of lighting technique that were very combustible. So it's very dangerous to be a lighting technician in this time period, and also somewhat dangerous to be an actor or an actress in this time period. However, with some of these changes came more control of the lighting. For example, when the incandescent light bulb was first developed, it allowed dimming of the lights and raising up the lights, and the light bulbs tended to be less flammable than limelight or anything that had been used before. So theaters began to have these full-sized generator rooms that were placed at the back of the theater in order to power all the lights that were used within the production. This is one of the first theatrical generator rooms in Boston in the United States. All right. when we talk about theater of the modern age, we cannot talk about it without discussing Konstantin Stanislavski and method acting, or what he referred to as the system of acting. Konstantin Stanislavski was actually not even like a professional actor. He was a playwright and a director. Um, and he actually worked for an electric company. um, but he developed the acting method called method acting that many actors still use today. And what his acting introduced in the modern age was to act as if. So the big if was the question that you were to answer. In earlier theater, you were basically acting to be heard, right? So that your words were heard and everything like that. In modern theater, suddenly, because everything seemed more realistic, acting also had to become more realistic. So instead of these set positions that neoclassical actors had, modern actors had to actually attempt to be realistic in their acting choices, which meant their their language, their volume at which they spoke was quieter. Um, the way that they moved across the stage was more natural. And so Konstantin Stanislavski developed this idea that you had to really get inside the character and ask yourself the magic if I was this person, how would I feel? How would this make me feel? And a lot of actors, like I said, still use it today and spend a lot of time staying in character even when they're not on the set or on the scene in order to maintain that kind of feeling of being a different person. Whereas in previous theater, it was very clear that the actor was not the character. So modern theater began to be hypo-realistic, developing working light switches, working water and things like that, where practical is the word for that, practical windows and doors that would open and close, which was not something that happened at any previous time. But like any great movement in the world, there is also an anti-movement. So anti-realistic theater also developed in the modern age. One of the types of theater called theater of the absurd. So in this type of theater, it was looking at like art should not replicate life. Art should give a different reflection of life. And life itself is absurd. And this is kind of brought about as the result of World War I and some of the world's wars that were happening in the time period, that made people think that the world itself was crazy, and therefore art should be a reflection of that descent into crazy. Waiting for Godot is an excellent example of a play, two characters on a bare stage. It's got a simple tree and a bench, and they are simply waiting for a third character to show up who never does. And there's other characters that do show up, and it's pretty nuts. And when we talk about it as more of a theater of the absurd or symbolic theater. Rhinoceros, Eugene Ionesco, very famous play where all the humans in the play slowly begin to turn into rhinoceri. And that's kind of some of the theater that happened at the time in this time period. A reaction against things that made sense by saying art does not need to make sense. Art simply needs to make us feel. All right. Contemporary theater, that's where we come to today. So we go from this age of hyporealism and also anti-realism into contemporary theater, where the theater that we look at today, I think, is best known because it has variety. So there are a variety in staging methods. We see proscenium theater, thrust theater, theater in the round, arena staging. We can see street theater, just like in the Middle Ages. So it kind of, theater of today takes theater that has happened at all different points in time and use it to represent theater now. So there's the proscenium stage, theater with their proscenium arches, the thrust stage, and the theater in the round. All of those have become more popular once again. But there's also avant-garde. There's realistic theater. We can see theater that is just like looking at a slice of life. We can see avant-garde theater. Looking Glass Theater in Chicago is an excellent example of a place that you can go to see some really avant-garde theater, as well as return to old forms. Mary Zimmerman, famous Chicagoan playwright, is well known for recreating Greek theater and Greek myths like the Odyssey or Roman myths like Metamorphosis into modern day interpretations. So we see that happening. Very realistic theater, very avant-garde theater, and very much return to old forms. Some of our plays, episodic plays, for example, like the Matthew Shepard play, Laramie, the Laramie, Wyoming play. I can't remember the name of it right now, but is an example, a great example of a play that kind of uses the idea of a chorus and actors taking on different characters throughout. Some of the plays that we're going to be reading in this class, 16 and 10, and different, same room, different story. Those plays are kind of the return to the old forms of theatrical chorus and different characters being different places. And then there's honestly a return to ritualistic theater, which we saw in the 60s and 70s more than today, but definitely return to old forms. There's also a Broadway theater trend of theater for the family from screen to stage. So, for example, Beauty and the Beast, the musical, The Lion King, the musical, Wicked, taking things that occurred first on the big screen and putting them onto the stage is kind of a trend in contemporary theater. All right, last thing to talk about is theater in Asia. Kabuki theater, Bunraku, and No. Kabuki theater is a very formalized type of theater, which is kind of similar to neoclassical theater in that there's stock characters in Kabuki theater, where and very highly painted, stylistic sort of characteristics in Kabuki theater, where you know that there is a character in that theater, in that type of theater, that is like the hero, and there's a character that is typically representative as the evil character, and you know that by their costume and their face paint and things like that. There is chorus and music in the background. You can kind of see in the back of this Kabuki presentation that there's a lot of drums and things like that. Greek theater used that as well. So we can kind of see a little bit of a similar feeling of that with Kabuki theater. Bunraku theater is puppet theater. And it's very interesting because in Bunraku theater, the puppets can be very large size, 4 to 5 feet tall puppets, and the actors themselves are kind of invisible. But then there's another form of Bunraku where the actors are 100% visible, like these actors right there, but they're all dressed in black and the puppets take the primary position. Bunraku is puppet theater. And then No theater is sort of like operatic theater. It is very long, 5-6 hours, not uncommon for a No theater performance to occur. Also highly ritualistic with masks and big costumes, and kind of remind us a little bit of maybe what some things look like in Greek theater. But No theater is also highly stylized. And the No theater space is the same wherever you go. It looks just like this because it's very kind of set. So that's theater in Asia. And there is a section in your textbook that'll give you a little bit more information about theater in Asia as well, if you're interested in that. So that ends our discussion of theater history and different types of theater. Hopefully you've gotten a little bit of a background that you didn't have before in our 4 screencasts on theater history. And in class, we'll talk a little bit about why knowing theater history is so important for someone who is interested in theater and wants to appreciate it, or someone who wants to get on the stage and actually act. Why should we know about this history in the first place? That's what we'll talk about in class.